It says. All right. Welcome to a live version of the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, or JOMA, podcast on COVID-19 vaccines and adolescents. I'm your host, Alisa Minkin. I am a general pediatrician and one of the heads of the JOMA Preventative Health Committee. Our goal tonight is to give you the most up-to-date and accurate information so you can make the best decision for your teen, not to push the vaccine. This is for educational purposes only. It is not medical advice. Please consult with your child's healthcare professional if you need specific advice. Also, the whole point of this being live is so you can ask your own questions. If you want to write in questions, you can put it in the Q&A box and you can hit remain anonymous. That is advisable to hit remain anonymous. So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Pellett Madan. She is a pediatric infectious disease specialist with expertise in the care of immunocompromised children. She completed her undergraduate education at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and attended medical school at the University of Pittsburgh. She then completed her pediatric residency and fellowship in pediatric infectious diseases at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City, where she began her work with pediatric solid organ and bone marrow transplantation recipients. She led the Pediatric Transplant Infectious Disease Program at the Children's Hospital at Montefiore Einstein College of Medicine for 10 years before moving to NYU in 2017, where she now serves as the Director of Pediatric Transplant Infectious Diseases at the Hassenfeld Children's Hospital at NYU Langone. She has authored multiple studies investigating how immunocompromised children respond to viral infections and immunizations. And more to the point of tonight, she is co-investigator for the NYU Vaccine and Treatment Evaluation Unit and a staff physician for the NYU Vaccine Center, which serves as a site for Pfizer and AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine trials. So wow, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me. And I should also add that I'm a mother. I have a 5-year-old child. You'll probably hear her in the bathtub. And vaccines are on the mind in our house as well. Every night at bedtime, she says, "Mommy, am I going to have to get a shot for the virus in the fall?" So we have the same questions in our household that everyone else is discussing.
Absolutely. So I want to start with just some basics without getting into too much detail. And just so everybody should know, we're not going to go into the same detail we've done on the JOMA website, on YouTube. We have a webinar from April 11th with Dr. Naor Bar-Zeev, who goes through the whole process of vaccine development. So I don't want to dive that deep, but I do want to explain what an emergency use authorization is, specifically because a lot of people are saying, don't you know that this is not FDA approved? It's experimental. So I'd like you to start with addressing that because that's a common concern, please.
Right. So really, this vaccine has gone through, or all of the vaccines that are approved under emergency authorization have gone through really vigorous vetting. When we talk about a vaccine or a medication being FDA approved, that means that a pharmaceutical company has spent a lot of money basically filling out all the FDA paperwork to get approval for very specific age groups. And when we have an emergency, such as a pandemic, there is a mechanism by which pharmaceutical companies can submit their data and undergo FDA approval and undergo CDC evaluation and other vettings, but without some of the regulatory paperwork that would normally be done. So this is basically a way of making sure that a vaccine is vetted and it's safe, but it's made available without going through all of the red tape that would normally slow availability.
So that's a good explanation. Now, of course, the reason we're doing this is because we now have emergency use authorization for the 12 to 15 age group.
Right.
And I think it's understandable, you as a mom, I as a mom, we can understand that people might be hesitant. It is a vaccine that is new and it is using technology that a lot of people are not familiar with. Thus, the other part of what I hear is experimental gene therapy. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about why there's so much falseness in that statement.
Yeah, so gene therapy actually refers to therapies that are used to actually change somebody's DNA. So for example, sometimes we have children who are born with very serious, incurable illnesses, and there have been trials for some illnesses to actually try to change those children's DNA to cure the illness. That's what gene therapy is. These vaccines are referred to as mRNA vaccines. And so that automatically makes people think about DNA and our genetics, but nothing about these vaccines changes our DNA. It doesn't change our gene makeup. These are simply a way for vaccines to teach our immune system how to respond to COVID, so that when we see it for the first time, our immune system can respond and we don't get sick. And this is incredible technology, and it's been in development for over a decade. We wanted to try to use this technology to develop a better vaccine for influenza. Many of you who are parents know that, your kids get the flu shot, and sometimes they still get flu, and that's because we need a better flu shot. So we've been trying to develop this technology for flu shots. This technology has been developed for vaccines against Ebola. And so we know a lot actually about how this technology works. And I'm really grateful that scientists were working on this and that they really had it ready to go, so that when we were faced with a once in a century pandemic, the technology was there and ready to develop into a safe vaccine.
Right. And also this is true for the viral vector DNA vaccines as well, because some people think, okay, well, mRNA, but then this one is DNA.
Yeah. Right. Well, right. Those are, so the DNA ones, are you referring to the adenovirus vector vaccines?
J&J or AstraZeneca specifically.
Right. Now, right now, we only have emergency use authorization for the mRNA vaccine, for the Pfizer mRNA vaccine.
For teens.
That's right. And also, I think probably we're going to have emergency use authorization for Moderna very soon in teenagers, which is also an mRNA vaccine. And they're actually, the way the vaccines work, Johnson & Johnson versus Pfizer, Moderna, they're very different. But as you said, none of them actually change our DNA.
Right. I mean, as opposed to, for example, you were talking about children. There was a famous case of a little girl who had something called spinal muscular atrophy, and she had this $2 million gene therapy that would basically be almost a cure for her. That's not what this is.
That's not what this is. It doesn't change our DNA.
Right. So it's really important to understand that. So thank you for the clarification. So the other most common question I hear is, but what about long-term effects? I'm very worried about long-term effects of this vaccine.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to kind of flip that I'm going to flip that question on the other side. So anytime we're talking about giving our children vaccines or giving our children medicine, we think about what are the risks and what are the benefits. And when COVID first hit, I remember feeling so thankful that it seemed like our children were going to be spared the brunt of this pandemic. And thank goodness that has, to a certain degree, proved true, but it's not really an accurate statement. We know that children can get quite sick from COVID. I've had the experience of taking care of premature infants, full-term infants, children and adolescents who were very sick in the intensive care unit with COVID. I've had children who became infected with COVID, and then it spread to their family members, and they lost a parent or a grandparent or someone who was close to them. We know we've had children who maybe had no symptoms of COVID, but then later on went to develop multi-system inflammatory syndrome and were incredibly sick in the ICU, and we've had children die from that. We've had children who months after their initial infection are still having symptoms. And what also concerns me as a pediatrician is that we may find that when children contract COVID, they have long-term problems with their heart or long-term predisposition to blood clots or stroke. For all we know, COVID might have really serious long-term effects on our children. So I first think about the risks of COVID, which I think are actually substantial in children.
Right. And that's the whole point, is that you'll have to compare the risks of COVID to the risk of the vaccine, not the risk of the vaccine to not doing the vaccine. And it's really, really important that we're learning more every day about what the illness is doing. I had someone say to me, my son is in Israel right now, and he had, thank God, a mild case of COVID. And I was talking to a vaccine hesitant parent whose son also had COVID. And she said to me, aren't you glad that your son had the real disease? He had the natural disease. And I had the exact opposite viewpoint. I would have loved for him to get the vaccine first, because to me, the vaccine isn't natural. And we already are seeing, if not what you would call long-term effects, because we don't have that long out there that we're looking at 18 months, we are seeing people who, and children and teens who are having long-term
Right.
long COVID, and that's occurring in children and teens as well.
Right. And, Israel has been administering mRNA vaccines to younger teenagers for quite a while now. I think they've administered mRNA vaccines to at least 500 children above the age of 12 in Israel. And so then, then when parents say to me, well, aren't you worried about the risk of this new vaccine in children? And, I have the advantage that I worked in a laboratory for a long time and I've done a lot of vaccine work. So, knowing what we know about the science of these vaccines, theoretically, I can't think of a reason for why these vaccines would be dangerous for children. And again, these vaccines go through very careful trials and vetting in children. And then even when we start to administer the vaccines to children in real life, we are very careful to document anything that occurs that we think could even remotely be a side effect. And if we start to see, a signal, we stop vaccinating and we look and see what's going on.
Great. I have a couple questions that are really good ones.
Great.
It's a really good question. Why hasn't mRNA technology been used previously? If it's been around for 10 years, why haven't we used it for regular flu?
Right. So it's good. I think it's going to be used very shortly for regular flu. Flu is a particularly challenging virus because it constantly mutates more than any other respiratory virus. And so really what we've been looking for is a universal flu vaccine that never has to be changed. I suspect very soon this technology will be used for flu. It takes, contrary to what we all believe, it takes a lot of pressure to make a pharmaceutical company put a vaccine on the market. It is a tremendous amount of money and work for them. They usually don't like to do it unless they have to. And I think that this was a crisis and this was the push that they needed to get it going.
Right. And there were a lot of factors that made it more doable, right? Funding and actually reduced liability, which is one of the sticking points, by the way, that the anti-vaxxers say, that there is reduced liability for the manufacturers, which is true under emergency use authorization. I do not believe it will be true when they get full licensure, which should be coming soon.
Right. And I want to address a couple of really important statements that some of my colleagues have brought up. So between the Pfizer and the Moderna trial, we've tested these mRNA vaccines in over 5,000 children so far. And we've seen no safety issues to date in children. And so far, the vaccines seem to be highly effective. That's a lot of kids to have in a vaccine trial. And we'll have even more as time goes on. And, these vaccines were vetted in cell culture models and then in animal models. Those animal trials went all the way through and then into preclinical testing and into phase 1 trials in adults. So none of these vaccines skipped any steps in terms of development.
I'm really glad you said that, because we had I didn't actually get the text of the question, but someone said something about animal trials were halted. And I think what's happening, and this is a piece of anti-vaccine misinformation, referring to the previous SARS vaccines, I think, where there was an antibody-dependent enhancement, which did not occur.
Right.
There were animal trials, they were not halted. There was no antibody-dependent enhancement, which I actually think is beyond the scope, just for you, to agree with me that this is correct, that the animal trials went through without any signals.
Right.
For this vaccine.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's really important. Another really good question is, did these children who became very sick from COVID, and we didn't talk about deaths from COVID, but I do believe, I'm not sure the number is really crystal clear, but I heard it's at least a couple hundred, which is more than we've seen from flu in a long time.
Yeah, well, we certainly, every year we have a lot of deaths from flu, particularly in children. But we have had at least, it seems like, around 600 children across the United States who have died with symptoms associated with COVID. And I think as we learn more about this virus and learn more about the spectrum of disease that it can cause, that number might go up a bit. And, even if you piece that apart and you think that number's kind of low, to be the parent, even if it's rare, to be the parent whose child ends up in the ICU or who misses a year of school because they get sick or suffers the loss of a family member when a child gets COVID, that is that no one wants to be that one parent, even if it's rare. That personally is not a risk I would want to take.
Right. Because out of many, I think several million children were reported as having COVID. But the rest of the question that I'm sorry I didn't finish was, did they have other health issues? Because that's what I get asked all the time. So if there were children that did poorly, were there children with underlying conditions?
The majority of children who have died have been children who had underlying health conditions, particularly leukemia, lymphoma, neurological disorders, underlying respiratory disorders. But there have been otherwise healthy children, children who got a high fever and had a febrile seizure and then had a complication as part of that. And then again, even sometimes when we're talking about the kids who were relatively healthy and survived, some of those are kids who still spent weeks in an intensive care unit with organ failure. And those kids are going to have major health sequelae.
Right. I mean, I think we have to get a balance. We don't want to be fear mongering, but we need to be honest. And I think back to when the measles was considered a routine childhood disease and it was on the Brady Bunch, they had it, it was so much fun. That was when there was no vaccine. So I think as we get a vaccine and we can prevent this in children, we can, without being fear mongering, just talk about this is what we're seeing, especially as we see more COVID in children, which I know as a pediatrician, I certainly see.
Right. Yeah. We want our children to be able to get back to their normal lives. We want them to be able to go to school with an uninterrupted school year. We want them to be able to go to camp and play sports. We want them to be able to spend time with their grandparents and their aunts and uncles. And so I'm hopeful that these vaccines are gonna get us closer to that goal.
Right, absolutely. Now you mentioned a couple thousand children being studied for the EUA, right? Which,
right.
First of all, people should understand that that's a very large number of children, because who's going to put their children in a study?
Right. So, first of all, like that's just the kids 12 to 15, right? That's not even including the kids 16 and older. So we have data from, thousands of kids 16 and older who are, physiologically not particularly different from 12 to 15-year-olds. It's also important to consider that, globally, billions of doses have now been administered to people who are 16, 18, 20s, 30s, and overwhelmingly these vaccines are safe and effective. And I think the data that we have from 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds certainly applies to teenagers. And now we're working on collecting data for infants down to 6 months so that we can hopefully move towards approval for the vaccine for our youngest patients in the fall.
You think it's in the fall going to go down to 6 months?
I think by early to mid-fall, yeah.
Wow. So Dr. Carmody actually also pointed out that we do have safety data 6 months out for Pfizer for adults age 16 and older, and that they're enough to apply for full licensure, because my understanding is that once you're 6 months out, you can apply for full licensure.
Right. And so we're actually almost pretty soon, I think, if you actually include the phase 1 data, pretty soon we're going to be almost a year out, because we started those phase 1 trials in late spring, early summer. So we're getting really close to that point.
Right. So a lot of people are saying, though, I want to wait for real long-term data. I'm not interested in 6 months. I'm not interested in a year. I'm interested in 5 or 10. That's long-term.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that? I know we kind of went over it a little bit before.
I think I try to be really sensitive to those concerns, because I think what's been challenging for everyone, doctors included, is that throughout the past year, every week we get new information, right? From sources that we have grown to trust, we get new information and things change. And so I can understand why people are anxious about this and want to wait. But I think as you've mentioned in some of our conversations, there can be consequences to that decision to wait. And so I think as time goes on and we see how the numbers change and how COVID epidemiology changes and what the risk is to our children of acquiring COVID in the community, there has to be kind of constant assessment of that. I think for people who really want to get back to their full lives, who want to send their kids to camp, who want their kids back in school full time, I think we need to have a really serious conversation about vaccination.
Absolutely. Right. And it's a moving target because we also have new variants. We're going to be having more travel, therefore, areas where it's not so prevalent right here, right now. But like I said, it's a moving target. And especially as we are taking our mask off here, which is so wonderful for so many of us to breathe, right, and get back to normalcy, it also means that those who are not vaccinated are at greater risk.
Right, right. I think, it's also important to consider that we're now accumulating a lot of data, very good safety and efficacy data for pregnant women. We're studying how the vaccine, so we know that lots of vaccines like whooping cough vaccine, flu vaccine, the reason why we're so aggressive about giving those to pregnant women is because we know the pregnant woman generates an immune response, it protects her, those protective antibodies then either cross the placenta or get into the breast milk. And so we know that COVID vaccine does not affect the placenta. It does not affect fetal growth. We have no data to suggest that it affects fertility. And what I find very positive is that we're starting to collect some data suggesting that those antibodies produced by the pregnant woman will hopefully protect her baby. We were very surprised over the spring and summer that we were having a lot of newborns admitted to the hospital with fever and no other symptoms. And we found that they had COVID. And, most of those babies did just fine. They didn't need to go to the ICU. They didn't need to get any extra breathing support, but they had very high fever. They couldn't feed well. They had to stay in the hospital for a few days. And in most of those cases, the mother unfortunately acquired COVID right around the time she delivered, and then the baby got it, and then the baby was admitted to the hospital.
Right. And again, we also don't know the long-term effects. It's to be avoided if possible.
Yeah, exactly.
A woman can get it while pregnant and give her baby some immunity. And it's also, I'm really glad that you briefly dispelled the fertility myths, but I have to say that it is super, super sticky in our communities. People believe it. And if you want more information and you haven't yet listened to our many webinars and podcasts on this topic, please check us out on YouTube, on the podcast. We've done this many times over. Another question unrelated to what we just discussed, but must be addressed is there are reports of thousands of deaths on the vaccine adverse, the VAERS database. And that's being used to say that this is so, so dangerous. So I'm going to ask you to address that, please.
Can you be more specific about the question? You're saying deaths related to this?
They're saying please address the 4,000 deaths in VAERS. That we have to explain that the VAERS database, right, is a passive database. Anybody can report anything that happens after a vaccine. It doesn't mean that it's connected.
Right. Well, part of the reason that VAERS was developed was so that we would have a centralized way of collating our vaccine safety data. So one of the reasons why VAERS exists is so that if there is any symptoms after vaccine administration, whether we think it's related or not, it's reported to VAERS, and then that allows us to go back into VAERS and say, okay, let's pull all the data for children who got rotavirus vaccine or who got whooping cough vaccine, and let's see if we're having a safety issue. And there's been no suggestion of a safety signal for adolescents who have received the Pfizer or the Moderna mRNA vaccines.
Right, but of those 4,000 deaths, those aren't deaths that are all connected to the vaccine as positive.
No.
Giving it to a very elderly population, and every day, unfortunately, elderly people die.
Right. So if somebody happens to actually even fall on the street and get hit by a car a week after they get a vaccine, that gets reported into VAERS. It's a temporal association. doesn't mean that it's related to the vaccine.
And we know the system works by what happened with the Johnson & Johnson and the blood clots.
Right.
Super rare.
What happened? We also know that it works from actually prior vaccines that have nothing to do with COVID. That's how we knew that we had to reformulate the rotavirus vaccine.
Right. So you're looking for the background rate, right? You're looking to see what do we expect for this age group within this time frame.
That's right.
Because something happens after something. In fact, I had a conversation recently with someone. The child had an underlying condition, and the parent said, it's poorly controlled. It's a seizure disorder, poorly controlled seizure disorder. And so I'm afraid, and they canceled their appointment. The day of the appointment, about half an hour after they're supposed to get the vaccine, the child had a seizure. So had they had the vaccine first, this would have been reported as an adverse effect. And yet, of course, they didn't get the vaccine. So just because something happens after doesn't mean it was caused by. Someone asked a very complex question here. Was the mRNA tested to see how long it takes with the lipid for the RNA to disintegrate with the lipid, since it's different than our natural mRNA? It's modified RNA. The M does not stand for modified, it stands for messenger.
Messenger, yeah. I think what they may be asking is basically how long does the messenger RNA stay in our body? And in particular, if it stays around for too long, does it kind of become part of our own DNA? And part of the reason why these vaccines need such careful temperature control is because the messenger RNA is very unstable. It doesn't stay around for very long. It stays around for hours. And then it basically disintegrates. It doesn't stay in our body.
Right, it's thinking Snapchat, right?
Right.
Which I don't understand, but other people do. Right, I think what they were asking though is they felt that this lipid is going to make it last abnormally long, but the lipid is just so we can get in, even that disintegrates.
It's just the vehicle to get it into the body.
Right.
To get it taken up by cells, right?
So another person asked, compare the risks of the vaccine, which we don't know, to the risk of COVID.
Right.
Which is what we were talking about before. We actually did answer this question about both short-term and long-term effects of COVID.
Yeah, I disagree that we don't know about the risks of the vaccine. I think that, so far we have really excellent safety data. We'll continue to collect safety data. And unfortunately, because of the way that things developed in the past year, we are very aware of the risks, both short-term and moderate to long-term in children when they actually contract COVID. And I think we have to remember that, children do have the capacity to spread COVID. Maybe not exactly to the capacity of adults, but children certainly can spread COVID. And so, children have the capacity to spread COVID to their grandparents, to their aunts, to their uncles, to people in their household who have the capacity to get very sick from it.
Right. So, everybody is very concerned. Parents are concerned. And this question here reflects the concern in a very granular way. They want actual numbers of the risk of COVID mortality and severe COVID effects. Is it 1 in 10,000? Is it 1 in 100,000? Because we have said up front that COVID is in general less severe to children. They're saying, how do I know that the risk of COVID outweighs the risk of the vaccine?
Right. I think one way to know is to talk to people in your community. I mean, sometimes that's almost the best. I don't think that it's going to take a while to be able to exactly say whether it's 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 2,000, because this is a pandemic that's only been in existence for the past year. And we're still trying to piece together exactly how it affects children, especially because in the beginning, we didn't even have testing available. We don't have great numbers in terms of how many children were even infected. But, if we think about our own communities and our own schools and our own neighborhoods, we all know families who have been affected by this. And I think that's, irrefutable evidence that this is a dangerous virus for adults and children.
Right. And I think, when you say look around you, you may not see this. If you just live in a regular community, you may not interact with anyone whose child had any more than a cold from COVID.
Yeah.
And I think that's why physician parents ran to get this for their adolescents.
Right.
You've seen it, but many people may not have seen it. So it's a very good question. And we see it as being a clear risk-benefit equation, trying to assess it as best we can with the information we have. And again, when somebody defines long-term as 5 to 10 years, they are, first of all, moving the goalpost, because clearly we can't talk about 5 to 10 years worth of data. We don't have it. We're making this decision now. And I always say we're making a risk-benefit decision with uncertainty.
Right.
So,
and also, I know that, some of the other physicians have asked, how do we determine what dose children need?
right.
And is this a vaccine that, eventually we're going to incorporate into the schedule and give with other vaccines? So in terms of the dose, basically what happens in all of these studies in the very beginning is that we tested various doses and then compared what kind of side effects people got, like low grade temperature, arm soreness, chills. And we also took their blood to see how much of an immune response we generated. And so we tried to kind of find that balance between a dose of vaccine that generates the right immune response, but also doesn't cause a lot of side effects. And so and because sometimes the dose that you need for an elderly person, for example, is much higher than what you need for a younger person, because elderly people can have really blunted vaccine responses. So we knew from some of the earlier studies what dose we needed in adolescents. Probably for right now, this is going to be a vaccine that we give as a standalone vaccine, meaning you're going to come and we're going to say, okay, let's make sure that you didn't get any vaccines, in the 2 weeks before this, and let's not give you any vaccines in the 2 weeks after this, so that if you do have fever or something, we know exactly that it's related to this vaccine. And then as time goes on, the advisory committee for immunization practices will sit down, look at the data, and kind of decide how this vaccine can be built into the regular childhood vaccine schedule. So normally we actually test vaccines together to see, okay, is it okay to give, MMR and chickenpox vaccine at the same time? Is it okay to give tetanus and whooping cough? So that's something that we'll have to sort out.
Mm-hmm. I actually think that the CDC just came out with saying that you don't have to space the vaccine, because I know we obsessed over that in my practice for about 2 weeks.
And not giving other doses right before, right after it.
Vaccine at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, even if they say that, it doesn't mean that a parent can't say or a physician can't say, let's just one at a time and be especially careful with this newer vaccine. It's very reasonable. Now, someone asks, where can I find data?
So, so just actually to go back to that last question, some of the issues is that some of these vaccines actually interact with one another so that they X out one another's immune response. So there's certain vaccines that from your practice that we don't give at the same time because they kind of interfere with one another. So that I do think that that's something that we're going to have to think a little bit about. So then your question is, where can I find this data? So all of these data are available. These are all publicly available data. The data are, usually they're released to the press. They're published in peer-reviewed journals. The data are made available by the FDA and the CDC. All of the hearings, all of the deliberations are made public. You can read them. You can listen to the recordings as well.
Thank you. So here I'm going to just read this so you can hear one person's thoughts. And I think this is a common thought. I'm a full believer in vaccines. I give my children all the necessary shots as recommended by my pediatrician. Awesome. I don't understand why I would vaccinate my children who have zero health risks against an illness that does not affect them. 2 of my children had COVID. We had no idea when they caught it. We only found out when they tested positive for antibodies.
Right.
That is a really common experience. Remember what I said before, that people will see what they see. I had a parent who said to me, I don't know why I would ever get a vaccine because I had COVID and I had no symptoms.
Right. Well, first of all, I'm really happy for them. That's a relief that those children are okay. And that's certainly what I want to happen. I don't want anyone's child to get sick from this. And I think really, for parents who are on the fence, give it some time. Think about it.
No pressure. That's what I said from the beginning. I don't believe in pressure for adults, that it should be a decision that they have the time and space. They get good information though.
Right.
That's my plea. Get good information from good sources. And I thank you for doing this. Don't leave yet. I thank you for giving us good information. And we're trying to be as honest and transparent as we can. The risk-benefit equation is going to be different for children. The younger we go, the more challenging it's going to be right, to have parents justify doing this to their healthy children. When we give a vaccine, it's much different from a medication for an illness. You're giving it to a healthy child.
And we all have, like, we all differ in terms of how much risk we're willing to accept in our lives, right?
Mhm.
Some of us are willing to accept more risk than others, or different types of risk. And I do think this is a scenario where, fortunately, the numbers have come down, and the amount of virus circulating, at least in our community, is low. Doesn't mean it's going to stay that way, but that's where it is now. We know that masks can be highly effective in preventing transmission. And so I do think that parents should take the time to really think about this, discuss it with their pediatrician, even if their pediatrician isn't going to be the one giving them the shot. Talk to their pediatrician, get
Absolutely.
their input, and think about it.
And what about children who do have underlying conditions? You're in a great position to talk about that.
Right. Um, most of my transplanted and oncology families and families whose children have neurological and respiratory disorders started contacting us in January saying, when can my child get this vaccine? Because for the past year, it's been, I'm afraid to send my child with a kidney transplant to school. I don't want them to get COVID and lose their kidney. I don't want my child with leukemia to miss a round of chemotherapy because they get COVID. And so, I think for those families, the risk benefit is very different, right? Because they've already suffered something that they never thought would happen to their child. And even if the risk of complicated COVID is low, it's just too much risk for them to tolerate.
Do children or even adults who have immune compromise make a good response to the COVID vaccine?
That is a very good question. And that's kind of the question that one of the questions I've been interested in tackling in my career. So I would say what we know from children who are getting chemotherapy, who are getting steroids from asthma, sickle cell disease, transplant, we suspect from various studies that probably the immune response to vaccines is a bit lower than healthy children, but that vaccines are still overwhelmingly protective for those children.
That's
So,
great.
for example, we know for the flu shot, which is, it's not our most effective vaccine, we know that immunocompromised children probably have a diminished immune response. But we also know that the vaccine is highly effective in preventing flu hospitalization and flu death. And so a lot of my, like, for example, I have a patient with cystic fibrosis, and he sent me a message the other day saying, I've just accepted a summer internship and I got the vaccine, but what if it's not enough? What should I still do the internship? And my response was, I think you should still do the internship. Be smart about the precautions that you take. And, from what we know, even if the vaccine is not 100% effective in preventing you from getting COVID, I think it's going to keep you from ending up in the hospital with COVID.
Mhm.
And I think that's ultimately what we want.
Right, and that I think is something that everybody should understand, not just for children or adults with problems, underlying issues, but for everyone, that the expectation should be that it's not 100% effective and it's not 100% safe. Like I said, we're making a risk-benefit decision, but it's amazing. I mean, what we're seeing so far is really more than we expected. So it's great.
Right, knock on wood, it stays that way.
Yes,
Right.
I know. Somebody said it was found that the spike is what generates the symptoms, so we don't know there won't be long-term side effects. So they're concerned that if we're generating spike protein to make an immune response, that somehow we are actually causing problems.
We're teaching the immune system how to attack the spike protein,
Mhm.
not causing long lasting, little mini copies of the spike protein in the body. We're
Mhm.
teaching the immune system how to recognize the spike protein and how to attack it when it sees it.
Wait, do we know how long the body makes the spike protein? Because there's a lot of misinformation about people who are vaccinated who are like little spike protein factories, and you shouldn't sit near them. They'll shed, they'll cause you to have abnormal this, that.
It's a very, very brief response. Your immune system is pretty efficient, right? It sees those, it picks them up, and it generates an immune response very quickly. And then those little those little replicas they go away. They don't
Right.
stay in the body.
Right, because you get the Snapchat message. You make, right? Not
Yeah,
for,
right.
not over and over and over. You're not making these spike
Well,
proteins.
and in the vaccine trials, especially in the phase 1 and phase 2 trials, people came in every week for lots and lots of blood draws so that we could investigate for all of the good concerns that people are raising. Is the virus changing my DNA? Are the spike proteins staying in my body in perpetuity? Am I going to be contagious to other people after I get the vaccine? That's why we did these really rigorous phase 1 and phase 2 trials.
And found out that we don't shed spike proteins. Make that quite crystal clear. A really important question is about those with antibodies. A lot of people have asked, even adults, if I had COVID and I have antibodies, why do I need the vaccine? So this question specifically is for someone who has antibodies, what testing have they done to test the difference in response to COVID in kids with natural immunity versus vaccine antibodies, especially in relation to T cells and variants? If none was completed, then why is it being pushed? Okay, so they're asking a really good question, which is how do we compare natural immunity to vaccine immunity? I think that's what they're asking. Am I right?
Yeah, and I know that antibody presence has been really important in a lot of communities. That's been used to decide, who can really re-enter the community. And I think we kind of don't know yet. So, for example, we know that when you get chickenpox as a child, you usually don't get chickenpox again during your childhood. You might get shingles when you're older because it reactivates, but you get chickenpox and then your immune system responds to it, and you usually don't get chickenpox again. And that is, for example, very different from, say, influenza or RSV, where you get it in December 2017, probably not going to get it again that winter, but you might get it 2 years later, you might get it 3 years later. And so it seems that when you get COVID, at least, the chances of getting COVID again in the next year are quite small. But we don't know that protection is going to go out to 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years. So we don't know exactly for how long you're protected after you have real COVID. We have had some patients, although infrequent, who have had a second infection within the first year. In fact, there have been transplant and other immunocompromised patients who got quite sick with their second infection, some of them with neurological symptoms. So again, if you know you have antibodies and you're not sure about the vaccine, it's okay again to wait a little bit, see what happens, see what more information we get, but be careful in your interactions.
Right. It's important to be honest that I don't hear this a lot in American messaging. In Israel, they weren't even giving the vaccine to those who had COVID, and then they're only giving one. They're really clearly acknowledging that so-called natural immunity appears to be good for most people for what we can see for now.
Now, when we started the phase 1 trials, in those early trials, we tested you when you enrolled. And if you had antibodies or if you knew you had COVID, we didn't enroll you in those trials. But as time went on and we expanded the studies to phase 2 and phase 3 trials, anyone could participate. Meaning, even if you had antibodies, which we check for in the beginning, or you knew you had COVID, you were eventually able to participate. So again, we have good safety data in people who had COVID and then got the vaccine as part of a trial. And now, just in terms of all of the, presumably millions of people who have gotten the COVID vaccine in real life probably had COVID as well. Many of my coworkers were quite sick with COVID, and I can tell you they were some of the first people to ask to get vaccinated in December.
Right. So we do see so far that it appears to be safe.
Yeah.
Vaccinated, and we are, as best I understand, for children as well, but it is not an unreasonable thing for someone to say, regardless, by the way, of what your antibody levels are, because you could potentially, like they mentioned, have T cell immunity. Your antibodies may drop. And we also, for the flip side, if you have high antibodies, we don't know what that means for immunity, right? We don't have at this point an exact correlate or protection to say this amount of antibodies, is actually protective.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I know you have to go. I promised you full stop at 9:15, and it is 9:15. Do you have a minute for another question? Am I pushing my luck here?
Yeah.
I wanted to know.
You'll all be shocked to hear that my child goes to bed quite late. So she's actually waiting in her room for me to put her to bed for 9:30, which is probably everyone else's kids are already in bed, but mine is not, right?
Contraindications? Are there any contraindications for adolescents? And then I'll let you go and I'll say goodbye for good.
So far, no contraindications. I think, probably this is not something that we're going to do to children who are in the middle of chemotherapy or who are getting a medication like rituximab that prevents them from mounting antibodies. So we're trying to vaccinate, if your child is chronically ill, we're trying to vaccinate them at a time when they're off their immunosuppression and we think they're going to have a better immune response. But so far, there's kind of no contraindications in terms of like having, heart disease, asthma, allergies, things like that.
Which is so good to know. Thank you so much for doing this with me. You can put your daughter to bed now.
My pleasure. I know this has been just a really difficult year for everyone, and everyone is sick and tired of hearing about COVID. And I'm happy that I hope that a year, 2 years from now, this will just be an obsolete topic. We'll see.
Oh, amen to that. But thank you so much for doing this. And for everybody who listened, thank you for listening. You can find much more about the COVID-19 vaccine on our website, joma.org/COVID-19, our YouTube channel, and on the podcast on most major podcast platforms, and on Instagram.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.